Welcome to the Home Meat Cutting Series, the Power Saw Lamb video. Processed like a pro. Whether you're just back from the hunt or from your local meat packer, you will find that by using proper techniques to custom cut your carcass, it will assure you a nicer meal on your dinner table. You will learn how to get the most out of your hunt, plus the satisfaction of knowing that it was done right. Here's your video meat cutter, Jim, to get you started.
Okay, now we're going to go ahead and cut this lamb up. We're going to use a basic technique, power saw, hand cut. Let's get started. What you can do is make sure that you're hitting it on the 5th rib. That's real important. Keep your chuck nice and square and come straight across it. You can either, once you know about where it is at the end of this blade, you can eyeball it. If you don't do a lot of them, go ahead and look inside and mark it on the 5th rib so you're sure to hit it. Get your lamb nice and square. Come straight across. Set the body aside. Now there's a couple different ways of cutting it. You can go straight through this way. You can stand it up. The best way, I think, is go ahead and get it started. Notch it where you can see it. And then what you want to do is look straight through it. That's a real nice break. What you want to do is see that right on both sides, nice and even. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take the brisket and the shank off. End of the brisket, lay it down, and then right through the shank here, and you kind of keep it square too. You're going to be taking your round bone here, your shoulder chops out of here. That's going to be a round bone chop right there. Your shank, all we're going to do is crack that for regular shanks. We'll set that aside. Okay, this is an example of a perfect break. Right through here you can see the spinal cord in it. Next we're going to take the brisket off through the shank. You want to come right around through here. That'll be your first round bone chop, and then right to the end of the brisket. We're just going to crack the shank. You can bone this out for trim or crack it. Nice piece of soup meat. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and break the legs away from the full loin, and it's actually the full back strap. And what we want to do is we want to come in, find that joint. Right here where the birth canal is, the H-bone starts, there's a joint right in here. We want to cut across that and about 1.5 joints from the end of the tailbone. Next we'll put it on the saw. What we're going to do is we're going to come down here, and another way of judging it is where your bottom round seams into your top round. There's a seam of fat right there you can see. You kind of move that, you get it lined up. You also want to think about keeping your sirloin fairly square. This is what you want to hit is this main leg bone right here. About the size of a dime is the old rule of thumb. That's right at that joint. You got about 1.5 joints here from the tailbone. Let's go ahead and cut these off. Set them aside. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and split straight down the backbone. Line this up right on that blade, and then looking down the saw, you can keep that line all the way down there. And this is critical. If you get off one side or another, you're actually going to be right in the middle of your chops. Once again, all you want to do is see that backbone right in there. You got to stay out of that meat. Like I said, if you get on one side or the other, then you're into the meat. Next, we're going to take the breast, flank, and riblets off. Let's do that. Okay, you want to line this up. Come straight down. Make sure you pull that flank out like that. This sirloin meat you don't want to get into. Next, we're going to take the riblets off. What I'm figuring is some nice chops and a nice rack. You want to come down and then fade away on it also. You don't want to get too far into that tail. We just took the breast, flank, riblets, and this is your rib and your full loin here. Those go aside to later. Next, we're going to go ahead and take the head loin off the short loin. How are we looking? Right there. What you want to do is you want to feel the dimple. It's at the end of the top sirloin or the head loin bone. You just feel that dimple, thinking to keep it nice and square. You cut that off. You want to hit that dimple right there. Next, we're going to take the flank. You got to pull this out a little bit on this side or you'll go right through it. Okay, I open this up. I'm going to take that flank and right on down through the breast. Those get cut a half. Then we're going to take the riblets off. Okay, next we're going to take the head loin off, keeping it nice and square right at the end of the dimple. We're going to cut that off. This can be cut boneless or bone in. We're going to go ahead and chine this bone off. It makes it a little easier when you're cutting. It doesn't give you so much bone dust. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. Get the fat off of it. It's just a little less trimming to do when you're done. I'm going to leave the tail on this too. Nowadays a lot of the stores are cutting this tail completely off and giving you the eye, but we're not going to do that because that tail's a nice piece of meat, and we're going to try to keep the least amount of trim. That's the whole thing in cutting a carcass like this, is making the least amount of trim. You got 7 ribs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's basically the end of the rib. The end of the rib is where the end of the loin is. This is your fillet. We're going to go ahead and chop the rib and the loin. There's a small blade here. That's the end of the blade. You want to take that out before you're knifing so you're not going through it. You want to figure a nice inch. You just knife right through them, keeping them nice and square. And go all the way down with them. Then you start getting down here, you have to figure out about how many chops you got to make some nice chops so you don't get a big thick one on the end or a real skinny one, and you get them all pretty nice and even is a big part of this. Clean this one up real good. Okay, we're going to clean the bottom of this up. It just makes it a little nicer when you go and slice it, then you don't have to come back and trim the top and the bottom. There's a little blade here we're going to go ahead and pull out. It's very easy, just one knife down one side and down the other. And on this particular rib and loin, he wants all chops. If you were going to go ahead and make a rib rack, you'd go 7 ribs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That'd be marked right there and right there. You'd come over here and that boom, and then you would remove it with either saw or hand saw, and that would give you your rack. He wants all chops, so we're going to chop this for him. What we're going to do, keep them nice, square. About 1 inch is a nice chop. If you want them a little thicker, a little thinner, depending on how you're going to cook them, you can do that. But this is just a nice, regular chop. Trying to make 2 chops per portion. And when you get to the end, make them even. Okay, what you want to do is keep them nice, square, pull the meat away so the bone, the saw blade isn't actually hitting the meat. Meat back, so the blade's not hitting the meat. You're actually just cutting the bone, and that saves you all the bone dust. It gives you the advantage of having no bone dust on your meat, but it gives you the ease of being able to cut it on a saw. Now we'll go ahead and trim these chops. What you do is just lay your knife straight down, cut this, trim the backside out, and roll that around. And one thing when you're trimming, try to remember is trim straight down. A lot of people will trim out, which means when you trim from the top down, your knife is at an angle out away from the meat, and what that does is when you flip the steak over, you have a bunch of fat on the bottom, or the opposite is some people trim in, which means when their knife is laying against the meat, they're trimming in, so when you turn the package over, it's leaner on the other side. And if you are cutting this lamb for display, you want your customer to feel like when they flip it over, that trim's going to be consistent all the way through it. Okay, I'm just trimming these ribs up. Same thing, trim straight down. Okay. Next we're going to cut this head loin. What it contains is your fillet and your sirloin, a piece of bottom sirloin, and actually a little tri-tip if we were talking about beef. There's a couple different ways to cut this, bone in or boneless. I'll show you one of each. Take the bone out. First thing you want to do is you want to clean this fat up. What we're going to do is take the bone out of it. You clean it up, tip of your knife, you come down, you take this fillet out. And what we're going to do is, if it was beef, we'd pull it all the way out because it's big enough to cut by itself. We're going to leave it on this and leave it on the sirloin, okay? Next thing you want to do is you want to come up back underneath here. You want to loosen this first joint up. Bring your knife in and crack it. It's the backbone right there where it turns. You break that joint loose. You keep your knife. And you just come around it. Take that bone out of there. Then clean this bottom up so we can see what's going on a little bit. Next step is get your knife underneath this bone, just the tip of it, and pull it back. And then stand that up. If it was a head loin, you'd be laying it down to bone it, but what you want to do is just using the tip of your knife. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm just running my knife and I'm just taking that bone out of there. Take that bone out, it's gone. Then you fold that fillet back over like that because you're going to knife it right onto that sirloin. If you take it off, it's almost useless because it's so small. Clean this up a little bit. That little piece of sirloin I'm going to make into a little bit of stew meat later. Go ahead and knife this. First thing in a piece of meat like this you want to do is you want to figure out about how many chops. You know, if you just take a thick one off, all of a sudden you're stuck and you got two thin ones or a thing. So you want to keep it even. And I figure it's about 4 inches, so I figure I can get about 4 chops out of it. And just mark it like that. And then if that works for you, cut them right through. And then we'll go ahead and trim these. Stand that up. Trim it down. And always try to see which side looks better on these, especially. There is a good and a bad side. And you always, for making things look nice, you want to put the good side up. And this bottom one is more like a face, so it takes a little bit more trimming. But still, it's a nice chop if you trim it properly. Be a boneless sirloin chop. Okay, now we're going to cut the other head loin bone in. Once again, trim that fat off there. Take that little piece of sirloin off that bottom, which is not going to be much good on the bottom of that chop. You trim this up. And now we're going to knife this. And once again, Try to figure out about how many chops you can get out of this. Figure I can get about 5 chops. And once again, you see how the break, nice and even, nice and square. That's the whole thing with cutting this stuff, keeping things nice and square. If you break it square, you get it on the block, you bone it, cut it, you get nice even chops. You got to pull back, once again trying to keep the meat away from the bone. Okay, now we're back over here, and we'll go ahead and trim these up. This little bone here on the end you can pull out too if you want to make them a little nicer and just leave that one bone in here. Once again, look at both sides of these because they have a tendency to having a good and a bad side. And this one needs a little bit extra trim in there. What I've done here is I've taken this large bone off the pin bone, off the backbone. I've just taken my knife and popped it off, and that makes for a little nicer bone-in chop too on some of those centers that have a big bone. Okay, what we got here out of those 2 loins was a lot of nice loin chops, rib chops, sirloin chops, bone-in and boneless. Those look nice, don't they? That's some nice looking lamb. Next, we're going to go ahead and work the riblets, the breast, and the flanks out. Let's go ahead and start with the riblets. These are real easy to do. Get your hand back. That pulls off. A little bit of trim. What we're going to do is knife in between them. Right through the middle of each bone, all the way down. Then you get to the end, you got no bone, but it's still a nice piece of meat. Go ahead and make a couple boneless ones to mix in there. First, all you do is get your hand underneath this seam. All that does is pull right out. What we're going to do is knife in between each one. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and do the breast. This is a piece of meat that a lot of guys will just bone it out, trim, whatever, but it's a decent piece of meat if cooked properly. What you do first of all is the same thing. You grab that skin, you pull that skin off there. Then what we do, score it like this. It helps show the meat up a little bit. Then lay it down. Get your knife right underneath between the meat and the bone, using the tip of it. Just score down it. Made a nice pocket for stuffing. Same thing on the other side. Go ahead and just get your finger underneath that skin, pull it down. Anything dry, trim it off. This is that skirt or inside diaphragm. If you were going to bone that out for trim because you couldn't use this, then you'd want to take this skirt off, and you can make pinwheels out of those or small skirt steaks. But all we're going to do is make stuffed breasts. So we're going to lay our tip of our knife underneath that bone. We're just going to run along a couple times, making a nice little pocket. Then, like I said, we'll score it. And that's kind of for show. That gets folded under for boating purposes. Here's another piece of meat. A lot of guys will throw it right in the old trim. It's the flank. Once again, all you do is, if it's dry, you can start by scoring down one side or the other. Get your hand underneath there. Pull that piece of skin off there. Turn it over. All this does is pull apart. You get to the end where it stops like that. You know that there's not much more there. Trim it off. Then you take this, and this will go ahead and be trim. And you try to keep your lamb trim fairly lean because as it grinds, the color doesn't overcome the fat like red meat would. Okay, on this flank, we're going to go ahead and just get our hand underneath the seam. I'm going to pull the skin down. A little bit of meat there goes in the trim. Do the back side. Try to keep this down. table. Just get your hand under there, finger, and pull that to where it stops. That one kind of tore. They're a real fragile piece of meat. They're very thin, and you'd have a couple of nice little flanks. If you were doing 3 or 4 lamb at one time, you'd have yourself a package or a little display. That's trim. That's trim. Now we've got our breast, our flanks, and our riblets. Those are all real nice and well worth getting. Next we've got the shanks and the brisket that we took off that arm. Basically with this is mostly trim or for regular shanks. All you want to do is clean them up a little bit. Now we'll do the shanks and the briskets. Basically all I did was crack them on the saw, cleaned them up a little bit. If there's any excess fat, you want to trim them off. Those make a nice pot of soup. Then on the brisket, what you want to do is, there's not much meat on the inside. If there is enough, try to get it out of there. It's well worth keeping. What you want to do is stand it up on end, knife right up against the bone, and all you can do is peel that off. Same thing with the other side. Right in there, there's a small seam. You can actually peel them off like a flank, but you want to cut up against that bone because this little layer of meat right here, small layer of meat. Okay, and there is some meat in between the bones if you want to go after it. And these get boned out. Very little meat, but if you're paid for this animal or you're cutting it up for somebody else, you want to try to save all the meat you can. You go right in between the bone. Okay. These get trimmed up a little bit. This is mostly for, they're almost useless as far as anything but really to grind. But it's a nice little piece of meat to go after. If you had a special deal, you needed a little bit of lamb stew or something like that, you could make a little bit of lamb stew out of it, which we'll do. Got our shanks and got our briskets. We're going to make a little stew out of that. That's going to be bone-in shank. Next, we're going to go ahead and cut the shoulder up. The shoulder basically contains your round bone, which is from this backbone to here, and there's a knuckle right here. You probably usually only get about 3 or 4 nice chops off here. Once again, note it's nice and square. That's the whole thing of cutting this stuff, keeping it square. It's basically done on a power saw all the way. You can get some of this throat meat out of here. Get this cleaned up, ready to go. Goes on the saw. Average chop is about 3/4. What you want to do is, you want to make sure that guide is locked. You want to make sure you're nice and square. That bone gets too big, about the size of a dime or so. It starts to get the size of a quarter. You stop. Stand it on end. Trim that back off. This is going to be a fairly long chop. Going to cut these about 3/4. That big bone right there will bone that last one out. Stand it on the edge, knock that off. Make sure you're pushing the meat through nice and square. Go all the way to the end. You'll hit that end of that knuckle there. You stop both ways. When the knuckle gets big one way, when the knuckle gets big the other one. This one might be able to get one more chop out of it. It's borderline. We'll have to do a little extra trimming, but it's still worth getting. On this neck, basically, all you do, you run your knife in between the two seams, cut that off, trim this off the top, and then what I do is I cut down between the meat and the bone, and you fold that over. Makes a nice looking neck. On this one, you come back, you trim all this fat off. So all you've got is that bone and this piece of meat. What I do is I cut down like this, and I open it up. Nice looking piece of neck. Then this is trim. There's a gland in there also, right in that shoulder. I just hit it right here. You want to make sure you certainly get this gland out of there. That goes in the can, not in the trim. There's also a gland in the back leg, which I'll show you in a second. Now open that up, and then it shows a lot more meat. On this piece, we'll go ahead and trim the fat out of it, so all you've got is the bone and the meat. Then I knife right through the middle of it, opening it up, so you're showing them a lot of meat. Then you come back, you trim this out. There's a gland right in the middle of that shoulder. Just hit it. You want to make sure that you get that out, and that goes in the trim, that goes in the can, not in your trim. This is what we yielded out of that chuck. We've got our blade chops, we've got our center cut shoulder chops, we've got that neck meat for soup, and we've got our round bone chops. Also, you can make these into roast. You know, you could have a round bone, chuck, neck roast, whatever you want. It just is a personal preference. We're mainly going through the whole thing so you can see all of it. Okay, on these legs, basically, all we're going to do is take this little piece of tailbone off there. Going to trim up the fat. Making sure it's real nice and clean. Goes on the saw. Next one we've already cleaned that tailbone off of, so I'll just clean up the rest of this dry meat. And that goes on the saw. Okay, what we're going to do is cut one in half and leave one whole. Basically, you're looking at about 50% of meat on this side, 50% on that side. You have to take in consideration that there's not much meat down here on this end. The angle that you want to run is the same angle as when this H-bone comes and turns. You want to hold this inside angle. That'll let you know that you're coming properly across the grain of the meat. So we're going to line that up, 50-50. Saw goes on. You're going to run it straight through. Then you're going to come back. You're going to roll this up. And you're going to crank that shank bone off there. That goes over there. Now on the whole one, what we're going to do is we're going to knock the top of that bone off. We're going to hang that up. Shank bone comes off. Clear that H-bone on that one too. Now, a thing that they used to do in the old days is they take this, they'd bend that over, and they tie that bone right to this. A nicer way, really, is to come in here, run your knife down both sides of this bone. This pops right out. You can't eat that anyways, and clean that up. If you're going to tie it, you could tie it like that. It's really not necessary. Another thing that's very important is there's a gland. On the bottom side where this heel is, there's a gland. It's not a bad idea to open this up, take your knife in there, even though it tears meat apart a little bit, and you pull that gland out of there. On the whole one, same thing. What we're going to do is we're going to just come in here, we're going to come back, keeping your knife right in by that bone. That bone pops right out of there. Now on a whole one like this, it's almost impossible to get that gland out of there. Just remember, without cutting it, cutting way into it, which will let a lot of juice out when you're cooking it, what I suggest is go ahead and cook it with it in it, but when you go to carve it, make sure you get it out. Okay. On this one, it's already ready to go. That's ready to go. Okay, here's those legs. This is the way we merchandise them. 1 whole roast, 2 legs. Also, I went back through. I got some packages of stew. That's the trim out of that whole lamb. And that's what you want. Got about less than 2.5 pounds there. It's nice and fresh. It's lean. Everything else is gone. I didn't get a lot of bone and fat either. I went through it, and that's the advantage of cutting these bone in is that you don't get a lot of bone and waste. We've taken a lamb and deconstructed it into a half a lamb and then taken the primals apart so that maybe you'll understand better where everything comes from. This is the whole leg. That's the breast. Here's your rack. This is the whole loin. Brisket, shank, and chuck. The chuck is also called a shoulder. Keep a good edge on your knife. Always makes a difference. If you're a meat cutter, we're going to take this leg and bone it out. Once again, we're trying to stress just keeping the tip of the knife up against the bone, angling towards the bone, trying to keep from cutting into the meat. Stay up against the bone, just like you're drawing a line with the tip of your knife. You hit that seam. Once you hit the seam, you pop out or you just cut it out. If there's any meat left on these bones, go ahead and clean it up. Every little bit helps. Being clean, if you think about it, if you're a meat cutter or a chef for your whole life, a lot of meat goes in the can. With this lamb, it's like venison. There's not much fat on it, so it's fairly easy to see where you're seaming. I'm just going from that one knuckle up by the sirloin tip all the way down to the knuckle by the birth canal. This is a knuckle up at the tip. I'm holding the knife and then you'll see it right there. It'll pop. Go around it once again, staying right clean up against the bone, seaming it away using the tip of the knife. Now I'm going around that knuckle bone and I'm going to come back up to the shank and just holding it. Keeping a firm grasp of the meat so it doesn't slide around with that bone. I've got my block nice and clean, free of fat or blood or anything. Came out nice and clean. If there is a little bit of trim on it, go ahead and go after it. Soup pot or bone can. Now we're going to remove the sirloin tip bone. We're going to remove the shank and the rat portion. Later on, I'm going to show you how to cut that rat up right there into small chunks, not to gum up your grinder blade. Really, it's not very good for anything else. There's this gland down in there we talked about earlier. I'm going to take that out. You do not want to get that on somebody's dinner plate. I'm going to remove this piece of rat. This is really probably the most gristly piece on the whole animal. That's a piece that you want to cut up in small pieces across the grain, not to plug up your grinding blade. I'm going to go ahead and trim this, clean this up. I'm going to trim it, and then I'm going to use the old butcher's knot to tie it. It makes for a lot more even cooking temperatures, makes for a lot nicer roast. You can use any knot you want. I'm going to use the butcher's knot. It's kind of a double knot. It works real well. Go ahead and start in the middle of the roast where it's thickest and then work to the ends. And the object is to get it nice and tight so it gets more cylindrical and even. It'll heat a lot more even in the oven. That's ready for the freezer or the oven. Next, we're going to cut these loins using a boneless method on the loin itself. We're going to cut the head loin bone in because that usually works out better. It's just easier and it's cleaner. And then we'll go after all the boneless out of the New York rib. Once again, nice even chops. Just visualize how many you can get before you start cutting. You can make your adjustment at that time. We're going to now put them on the saw. Safety first, keeping our hands away from the saw at all times. You really have to concentrate for safety's sake when working on a saw, realizing that that saw doesn't know whether it's cutting a piece of meat or your thumb. You're pulling the meat apart, just cutting through the bone, keeping the bone dust off the face of the meat. A nicer looking piece of meat, and it's more case life out of that piece of meat, not having to be scraped. I'm going to go ahead and remove the pin bone on these at this time. It makes for a nicer chop. You don't need that big bone in there, and then this is a real traditional style. Just removing the pin bone and just leaving that one bone in there. It's a lot nicer for cooking. I'm going to remove the fillet now. It's a pretty small piece of meat. When you cut it like this, you can put 3 or 4 of those together and maybe get yourself a little meal. I'm just taking that fillet out of there. Now I'm going to cut along the rib bone. I'm going to angle my knife against the bone. Using just the point of the knife against the bone, trying not to cut into the meat, keeping it clean against the bone. You'd much rather have that meat on those center cut chops, butterfly chops, than you would on that bone in reality. The bones down on the other end by the New York, we'll need to bone those out. We're going to cut those into soup bones, utilizing every piece of this animal. That's the whole theory of this, doing it yourself or doing it for somebody else, is to do the best you can by keeping everything out of the bone can and on the dinner table. Once again, being nice and clean, not cutting into the meat, leaving the bulk of the meat on the loin and rib itself, not on that rib bone. We'll go ahead and do the other side. We're just going to seam the fillet away using the tip of the knife up against the bone. We'll stand this on the end right there. Got a 7 rib. Once again, angling the blade back into the bone, away from the meat. Much better to keep it on the actual loin rib than on your neck bones and what's going to be your rack or spare ribs. It's not much meat on it, but it's certainly better than boning it out. You get literally nothing when you bone them out. We're going to cut that backbone into a neck, and it looks more like a neck bone. We'll go ahead and chine those bones down away from your rack bones. Those are your little spare ribs. And then they'll give you a couple little spare ribs. The other piece off the loin, actually, we're going to cut up for soup meat. Goes with some neck bones. Now what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to trim this up a little bit. That's that last blade, which if you break it properly, you should just have one rib worth of blade on the end. We're going to go ahead and butterfly these, cutting every other chop all the way through, and then the chop in the middle, you're only going to cut through about 3/4 of the way. And then when you open those up, it'll give you a better portion, because these are fairly small chops, as in most deer. This technique works well for making a little nicer portion. And you just open them up, trim up the tail if it needs it. This is a real traditional style for cutting animals that have a little smaller meat mass to them. Once again, I'm just going to butterfly these by cutting every other one all the way through, then part way through, then all the way through, then part way through, then all the way through. And that'll give you your butterflies. This is that rat we talked about. This is a really gristly piece of meat. You want to cut this into very small pieces across the tendons. Get rid of the heavy tendons so not to plug up your grinding blade. This is the yield out of that loin. Those are your fillets, your rack, your boneless butterflies, neck bones, a little bit of stew meat, trim, sirloin chops. This is a nice way to cut a lamb up. I hope these tips I've shown you today will be helpful. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching. We trust that you found this video both informative and interesting. Other titles include everything you'll need to learn to process your meat, poultry, and fish. Process like a pro.